You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Founded in 1881, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUVCW.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 462 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
We hope everyone, at least here in the States, had a good 4th of July. Probably like a lot of you, we've had some different things going on here with a long holiday weekend. So right up front, we'll let you know this will be a shorter episode. So, please lower your expectations accordingly.
Rich. In any case, with this show, we'll be heading down to the Sunshine State and setting the stage for the largest clash that took place in Florida during the Civil War, the Battle of Olustee, which was fought on February 20th, 1864.
We really haven't talked about Florida very much so far during the course of the podcast. That's because for most of the war, it was a sideshow to the big show, to borrow a phrase from Sam Watkins. But Florida sent men to serve in the Confederacy's two main armies, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee. But as for Florida itself, it was, for the most part, a military backwater for much of the war.
Florida was the third state to secede in January 1861, following South Carolina and Mississippi out of the Union. Florida was the least populous member of the Confederacy. It had only been a state since 1845, and in 1860 had a population of 140,000 people, of whom 62,000 were slaves and another 1,000 were free blacks.
Out of a population of around 77,000 whites, about 15,000 Floridians served in the Confederate military during the Civil War. Floridians like Edmund Kirby Smith and William Wing Loring served as general officers in the rebel armies, while Stephen Mallory of Key West proved to be an able Secretary of the Navy in Jefferson Davis's cabinet.
Governor John Milton labored to place Florida on a wartime footing and aid the greater Confederate war effort. He firmly believed in cooperating with the central government in Richmond and was willing to defer to the national good as the Confederates worked to secure the independence of their southern slaveholding republic.
From the start, Milton faced many difficult challenges, not least of which was how Florida, with her lengthy coastline, could be defended. The Federals already retained control of Fort Pickens at the mouth of Pensacola Bay, along with Forts Taylor and Jefferson far to the south in the Florida Keys. By mid-1862, Federal troops held Fernandina, St. Augustine, and Key West, and began a series of on-again, off-again occupations of Jacksonville. Blockading ships of the Union Navy also effectively sealed off Apalachicola and Tampa on the Gulf Coast.
There was nothing of any major strategic importance to the Confederacy within Florida, and the state's liabilities, particularly her long, vulnerable coastline and limited transportation network, far outweighed her assets. And so by the end of 1862, Florida found herself abandoned militarily by the Confederacy.
In the spring of 1862, as part of its concentration of men in northern Mississippi before the Battle of Shiloh, the Confederate War Department decided to pull troops out of Florida. By the end of the year, Florida's manpower resources had largely been siphoned off to bolster Confederate armies on other fronts. And when this happened, Florida was left to defend herself as best she could, using her own resources.
As a result, her defense was limited to small, unevenly trained, and poorly armed home guard units that were widely dispersed over the state and that operated more like partisan rangers rather than a regular army.
By 1863, the Federals were largely limiting themselves to tightening the blockade and making small-scale raids from their coastal enclaves. And when the Yankees did venture forth, the ragtag assortment of Florida Home Guard units struck at them when the opportunity arose. But during the first 2 years of the war, it became obvious Florida held little importance for either side.
Florida's status as a mostly irrelevant backwater of the war began to change in 1863 for the Confederates, with the fall of Vicksburg and loss of Port Hudson. The Federal victories at those two places gave the Yankees control of the Mississippi River along its entire length and cut the Confederacy in two. That meant in the summer of 1863, the flow of supplies from Texas was cut off.
Also that summer, Rosecrans' brilliant Tullahoma campaign maneuvered the Confederates completely out of Middle Tennessee, another important breadbasket region. The loss of Middle Tennessee was a further blow to rebel logistics.
And so, because of events elsewhere during the summer of 1863, Florida was now a crucial source of provisions for the Confederates, especially Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee and also P.G.T. Beauregard's forces at Charleston, South Carolina.
Interestingly, up until this point, Florida's most important contribution to the rebel war effort was arguably in the form of vital salt extracted from boiling salt water. Well, salt, of course, back in those olden days, was a critical component in food preservation, and so was an important resource, not only on the home front, but also militarily, as far as keeping armies supplied. During the war for the Confederacy, the scarcity of salt was a real concern, and so the locations that produced it took on strategic importance.
The heaviest concentration of salt works in Florida extended from St. Mark's to St. Andrews Bay on the northern Gulf Shore. These elaborate salt plants represented an investment of millions of dollars by the end of the war.
Salt water boiled away all day and all night, despite Union sailors landing along the coast to smash the precious boilers. Tons of salt from those plants made their way into Georgia and Alabama, where they preserved meat for rations for the Confederate armies.
Florida's main food contribution to the Confederacy was in the form of beef cattle. After 1863, herds in Central and South Florida were tapped for at least 75,000 head to feed rebel soldiers from North Georgia to Charleston.
Florida's lack of a direct rail connection to, well, anywhere, but especially to Georgia, was a major factor in its status as a strategic backwater early in the war. But fortunately for the Confederates, beef, in the form of cattle on the hoof, could be driven north for transport, and in that way overcome the 26 or so mile gap in the rail lines between Florida and Georgia.
By the end of 1863, the supply of Florida's cattle for beef and hogs for bacon had become crucial to the Confederate war effort. By the end of the year, the chief commissary officer for the Army of Tennessee in North Georgia stated, quote, "We are almost entirely dependent on Florida." This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Do you have an interest in the Civil War? Founded in 1881, the SUV-CW is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
The national headquarters of the SUV-CW is located at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The SUV-CW is the heir to the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic, the famous post-war National Association of Union Civil War Veterans. Based on the principles of fraternity, charity, and loyalty, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUV-CW.
How did America go from a struggling series of settlements at the edge of a wilderness into the most powerful, prosperous, influential nation anywhere on Earth? A lot of people say, well, it's just a pattern of happy accidents. But a pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern. The American Miracle tells that story. This is Michael Medved. I've been a historian for many years, 14 books, a radio host, fascinated during all that time with the bizarre series of coincidences that allowed the United States to acquire Alaska, or the Louisiana Purchase. Individuals in our past who seem to have been providentially placed where they could make a major difference. Subscribe to the American Miracle on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Even as Florida took on new importance for the Confederacy, the same was true for the Union. The Confederate military's increased dependence on Florida's foodstuffs didn't escape the Federalists' attention, of course, but there was also an intriguing political component to the Yankees' new interest in the state in early 1864.
In December 1863 and January 1864, Major General Quincy Gilmore, commander of the Federalist Department of the South, corresponded with General-in-Chief Henry Halleck in Washington regarding Gilmore's proposal to land a force at Jacksonville and launch an expedition into the interior of Northeast Florida.
Gilmore argued that not only would such an operation do much to disrupt the flow of vital supplies from Florida to the rebel armies and so deal a blow to the Confederate war effort, but it would also benefit the Union war effort by allowing the Federals access to the interior of Florida and the large population of slaves there. You see, Gilmore was a proponent of the use of black troops, and he viewed the middle counties of Florida as a prime recruiting ground from which his department could gain large numbers of enlistments from freed and escaped slaves.
So, in early 1864, Gilmore certainly had legitimate reasons for establishing an active federal military presence in Northeast Florida. But then Abraham Lincoln injected politics into the mix as well.
As you guys know, 1864 was going to be an important election year. Everyone realized the result of the presidential contest in the fall would have a significant impact on the course of the war. If Lincoln won re-election, he would stay the course, seeking to crush the rebellion. However, if the Democratic Party's candidate won, it would seem likely there would be a negotiated settlement that would end the fighting, with the Confederacy having secured its independence.
By the end of 1863, reports reached Lincoln that many of the citizens of Northeast Florida had lost all enthusiasm for the Confederate cause and would be open to reconstructing a loyal state government under the terms of the president's recent so-called 10% plan, by which a seceded state could rejoin the Union after 10% of its voting-age males took loyalty oaths, and the state recognized the permanent freedom of formerly enslaved people.
An idea formed in Lincoln's mind when he learned of Gilmore's upcoming operation in Northeast Florida. If Florida could be reconstructed fairly easily here early in 1864, it would be a state beholden to Lincoln for its readmittance to the Union, and therefore could be expected to cast its support to him, not only against any Republican challengers at the party convention that summer, but also in the all-important presidential election that fall.
At a time when Lincoln was facing opposition to his renomination from disgruntled radical Republicans, and when it looked as if the Democrats would mount a serious threat to win the White House in the fall, the idea that a reconstructed Florida might very well make a real difference in the political battles ahead was not at all far-fetched.
And so Lincoln wrote to Gilmore on January 13, 1864, telling the general of the reports he'd heard regarding Unionist sentiment in Northeast Florida, and saying he'd given a trusted aide, one of his personal secretaries, John Hay, a commission as a major in the Union Army, and was sending him to Florida along with Gilmore.
Hay had volunteered his services to Lincoln for this assignment. He would set the 10% plan in motion in Florida. To that end, he was supplied with record books to document the swearing of loyalty oaths and certificates to be given to all those who pledged allegiance to the government of the United States.
Lincoln made clear to Gilmore that he understood the general's military objectives would take precedence over any politicking by Hay. But the president also said he would be, quote-unquote, greatly obliged if Gilmore gave Hay as much assistance as possible.
And that's where we'll leave things for this episode. We'll pick up right here next time with the Federals landing at Jacksonville on February 7, 1864, to establish a base of operations for their strike into the interior of Northeast Florida.
As we'll see next time, the value of Florida to the Confederates as a major supply source means they all have to respond in force to the federal incursion, which means rebel troops will have to be rushed to defend the hitherto neglected state. When the opposing forces clash at Olustee on February 20th, the battle will not only cap the federal attempt to wrest control of the region from the rebels and bring the Sunshine State back into the Union, but it will also determine whether the Confederates could continue to depend on a steady stream of much-needed provisions from Florida.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Confederate Florida, The Road to Olustee by William H. Nolte.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations at the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Dot Point, Michael A., The Wizard 0957, and Tom D. Thanks, one and all.
Also, a big thanks to Eric S. for his recent donation.
And last but not least, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.